Have you ever had a moment that completely shook your world and made you question everything you thought you knew? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. It all started out so ordinary, just another day in my life as a stepmom, trying my best to get along with my new family. But things took a sharp turn, one I never saw coming. My stepson, who had always seemed distant and somewhat cold toward me, suddenly began acting in ways that completely caught me off guard. I never imagined that my relationship with him would spiral into something that would leave me reeling. At first, it was subtle, a lingering look, a gesture here and there, nothing I could fully pin down. But as time went on, the signs became harder to ignore. It wasn't just typical teenage rebellion or the usual awkwardness of blending two families together. No, this felt different. Something was off. He seemed to be pushing boundaries in ways I couldn't quite understand, and the tension between us started to build. I began wondering if my role as a stepmom was really as simple as I thought it would be. But nothing could prepare me for what happened next. The trust that I had tried so hard to build with him started to unravel in ways I never imagined possible. The more I tried to pull back and reassess my place in the family, the more his actions seemed to point in a direction that was impossible to ignore. And that's when I realized the painful truth. My stepson had crossed a line that left me completely shaken, questioning not only my relationship with him, but my entire role in this new family dynamic. What did he do? How did it all unfold? And what happened when I finally confronted the situation? Well, stick around, because the story doesn't end here. Trust me, you won't believe how this all plays out in the next part of this journey. Stay tuned for the shocking truth. As time went on, the odd behaviors started to pile up, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. It wasn't just little things anymore. It was the way he would watch me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, or how he'd sneak into conversations, inserting himself in ways that felt inappropriate for his age. I couldn't help but feel a growing unease every time he was around. At first, I chalked it up to typical teenage confusion or maybe just growing pains. After all, I knew that blending families wasn't easy. But deep down, something about the way he was acting toward me felt wrong. It didn't help that my husband was often away on business. His absence made it harder for me to gauge what was really going on between us. I started to wonder if I was overreacting, if maybe I was just too sensitive. But every time I'd have a conversation with him, there was this strange tension in the air, as if he was testing the boundaries of our relationship. I tried my best to approach the situation with understanding. Maybe he was struggling with the idea of having a new parental figure in his life, or perhaps there was something going on in his personal world that he wasn't ready to talk about. I wasn't sure, but I kept trying to remain patient. Then, one afternoon, something happened that made it all too clear. I had just returned from the store carrying a bag of groceries when I found him in the living room, staring at me. He didn't say anything at first, but his gaze was intense, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to react. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I tried to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. He finally spoke, but what he said made my blood run cold. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something, but I didn't know how to bring it up." I froze. What was going on in his mind? And what could he possibly want to talk about with me? I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His words hung in the air like a weight I couldn't shake. I tried to keep my voice steady, asking, "What's going on? What do you want to talk about?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes for a second before meeting them again, this time with an expression I couldn't quite read. It's It's been hard for me," he finally said, his voice quiet. "Having you around all the time, I mean." The words were simple enough, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken. I felt a pit form in my stomach as I tried to process what he was saying. Look, he continued, I know it's not your fault, but things just feel different now. Since you married Dad, everything's changed. I nodded slowly, trying to understand. It wasn't like I didn't get it. It was a big adjustment for all of us, but something about the way he was saying it felt like there was more he wasn't telling me. What do you mean by different? I asked, barely able to hold back the tremor in my voice. He paused, then his gaze dropped to the floor, and he muttered, almost too softly to hear, I just don't know how to handle everything anymore, especially with you. His words were cryptic, but they hit me hard, and a sense of dread settled deep in my chest. What was he really trying to say? And where was all of this leading? The silence between us grew thicker, suffocating almost. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every second stretching on endlessly. His words hung in the air like a riddle I couldn't solve. I had never felt this uneasy around him before. It wasn't just the tension anymore. It was something deeper, something unspoken that I couldn't put my finger on. I leaned in, trying to close the distance between us, though a part of me felt like stepping back. What do you mean? How to handle everything? You can talk to me? You know that, right? My voice was almost pleading, but I didn't care. I needed him to open up, to say what was on his mind, because every moment of hesitation made my stomach tighten more. He shifted uncomfortably again, glancing around the room as if looking for an escape. His words came out slowly, as if weighing each one carefully. I just feel confused, and I don't know what to do anymore. There was a strange intensity in his eyes now, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, but it only left me with more questions. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. What was he trying to say? What was this really about? And then, just as the tension felt like it might explode, he finally blurted out the one thing I never expected to hear. I'm not sure I can live with you being here anymore. I froze. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to go off. I'm not sure I can live with you being here anymore. I stood frozen, my mind spinning, my heart racing in disbelief. It felt like the ground had slipped out from under me. This wasn't the angry outburst of a rebellious teenager. This was something deeper, something darker. My mind struggled to process what he had just said, but before I could gather my thoughts, he continued. I've been talking to Dad, he said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. And he's been understanding, but it's just been so hard. I don't know how to explain it. Everything feels like it's falling apart. I could feel my pulse quicken. Talking to Dad about what? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My gut told me I wasn't going to like the answer. He hesitated before speaking, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. About, about us, he finally said, as though it pained him to say it out loud. My heart skipped a beat. Us? I repeated, my voice cracking. I mean, things haven't been right, and I don't know what to do with it anymore. I don't want to live like this. The words spilled out like a flood, and I felt as if the walls around me were closing in. But then, just as I was about to ask him to explain further, the front door opened. My husband stepped inside, his face drawn and tired. He looked at the two of us, exchanging a glance that was impossible to ignore. In that instant, I knew something had changed. Something much bigger was going on, something I couldn't quite see yet, and I was about to be caught in the middle of it all. My heart was pounding as my husband stepped into the room, his tired eyes flicking between me and my stepson. The tension was unbearable, and I could barely hold my breath as I tried to make sense of what had just been said. I looked at my husband, searching for any sign that he understood what was happening, but his expression was unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made my skin prickle. Before I could speak, my stepson broke the silence. I I don't want to live like this anymore, Dad. It's just not working. I've tried to talk to her, but it's too much, and I can't handle it. His words hung in the air, raw and filled with emotion, and my husband's face darkened, as if the weight of it all had finally hit him. I opened my mouth, desperate to explain, to share my side of the story. But before I could say anything, my husband looked at me, his eyes cold. "I think we need to talk," he said, alone. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I nodded silently, my mind racing, as I watched my husband lead our son to the kitchen. I stayed behind, heart sinking. What was happening? What had gone wrong? Why was everything falling apart so quickly? Just as I began to feel a wave of helplessness wash over me, I heard muffled voices from the other room. But then, something unexpected happened. The sound of a door opening caught my attention. I turned around only to see my husband standing in the doorway, but this time there was no anger in his eyes. Instead, there was a look of regret. "I found something I wasn't expecting," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "And I think you need to know the truth." I stood frozen, waiting for him to continue, but the weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but I didn't know if I was ready to hear what he was about to say. My husband stepped forward, holding something in his hand, an envelope, old and worn. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something darker, something that told me this wasn't going to be easy to understand. "I've been keeping something from you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Something from my past. Something you need to know about." I felt a cold rush of panic flood through me. What could it possibly be? How did it connect to everything that had been happening with my stepson? He opened the envelope slowly, pulling out a letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar to me. My husband cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "I know what you've been hiding. I know what happened, and I'm not going to let it go any longer." As the words sank in, my mind exploded with questions. "What is this? Who wrote it?" I managed to ask, barely able to get the words out. "This letter," my husband whispered, "was from my ex-wife." I felt my breath catch in my throat. The truth that had been buried for so long was finally coming to light. She had known about things that neither of us had ever acknowledged, about a secret between her and my stepson that had been hidden under the surface for years. The room seemed to spin as everything clicked into place. My stepson's odd behavior, the tension, the strain in our family. It was all tied to something far deeper than I ever realized. The layers of lies, the unspoken truth, and the consequences of them were finally coming to a head. "Dad, I didn't know how to tell you," my stepson said quietly, his voice barely a whisper from the doorway. As the pieces of the puzzle finally came together, I understood now more than ever how fragile relationships could be. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but the truth was the first step in healing. And as painful as it was, I knew we had to face it together, step by step. The question was no longer whether we could rebuild, but whether we were all ready to confront the damage and start fresh. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It was time to face the truth, no matter how hard it was.